There's a 5-stage playbook that has been used to consolidate financial power after every major crisis for over a century. 1907, 2008, 2023, same playbook, same outcome, more power for the rescuers. Here's how it was invented. On the night of November 2nd, 1907, the most powerful banker in America locked 40 men in his private library. J.P. Morgan's library on Madison Avenue was filled with priceless Renaissance manuscripts and Gutenberg Bibles. That night, it became a prison. The men inside were the presidents and chairmen of New York's largest banks and trust companies. They had been summoned at 10 p.m. with no explanation. When they arrived, Morgan's associates closed the heavy oak doors behind them, and Morgan pocketed the only key. The American financial system was collapsing around them. Banks had been failing across New York for 2 weeks. Depositors were lining up in the streets, demanding their money in gold and cash. The stock market had crashed 50% in 3 weeks, and the United States government could do nothing to stop it, because in 1907 there was no Federal Reserve, no central bank, no lender of last resort, no institution with the power to inject emergency money into the system. When a financial panic hit, there was no safety net, just chaos. So J.P. Morgan, a private citizen with no government authority, took control of the American economy. He presented the bankers with a plan. Each institution would contribute funds according to its size. The money would be pooled to rescue failing trust companies and keep the stock exchange open. And no one would leave his library until everyone signed the agreement. Some bankers resisted. Why should they risk their own capital to save competitors who had made bad decisions? Morgan was immovable. He sat in a corner playing solitaire, occasionally looking up to say, "This is what we're doing." At 3 a.m., the bankers were still arguing. Morgan had his librarian bring out a single sheet of paper, the agreement committing each institution to contribute its share. He placed it on the table and looked at the most reluctant banker in the room. "There's the pen," Morgan said. The banker signed, the others followed. By 4:45 a.m., every signature was on the page. $25 million was pledged. The stock exchange would open. The panic would end. J.P. Morgan had personally saved the American financial system. The newspapers called him a hero. Congress thanked him publicly. President Theodore Roosevelt sent his congratulations. But here's what they don't teach you about the panic of 1907. Morgan didn't just save the system, he demonstrated something far more valuable, that one private entity could control the entire American economy in a crisis. And 6 years later, he used that demonstration to help design the Federal Reserve, a central bank that would institutionalize the power Morgan had shown was possible, the power to rescue, the power to choose which institutions survive and which fail, the power to control. The panic of 1907 started with a failed scheme to corner the copper market. Two speculators, F. Augustus Heinze and Charles W. Morse, had been trying to monopolize United Copper Company shares. They borrowed millions from banks they personally controlled to buy stock and squeeze short sellers. The scheme collapsed in mid-October when short sellers found shares to deliver. United Copper's stock crashed from $60 to $10 in 2 days. The banks that had lent money to Heinze and Morse were suddenly exposed. On October 22, 1907, the Knickerbocker Trust Company faced a bank run. Knickerbocker was one of New York's largest financial institutions with $65 million in deposits. It had connections to the failed copper scheme through its president, Charles Barney. Rumors spread that Knickerbocker was insolvent. Depositors lined up outside its ornate Fifth Avenue headquarters before dawn. By noon, the bank had paid out $8 million in withdrawals. By 2 p.m., the cash was gone. Knickerbocker closed its doors. 3 weeks later, Charles Barney shot himself. The closure triggered panic across New York. If Knickerbocker could fail, any bank could fail. Within days, depositors were running on banks throughout the city. The Trust Company of America lost $34 million in deposits in a single week. Lincoln Trust was hemorrhaging cash, and the federal government was powerless to stop it. President Theodore Roosevelt was in Washington when the panic began. He sent Treasury Secretary George Cortelyou to New York with instructions to do whatever was necessary. But what could Cortelyou do? The Treasury had limited funds and no legal authority to bail out private banks. There was no mechanism to inject liquidity into the banking system. The government wasn't designed to manage financial crises. Cortelyou deposited $25 million of government funds into select New York banks. It wasn't enough, because the panic wasn't about the amount of money in the system, it was about trust. And trust, once broken, cannot be restored by government deposits. By late October, the crisis had spread beyond banks. The New York Stock Exchange was running out of money. Brokers needed cash to settle trades, but banks wouldn't lend. They were hoarding every dollar to meet depositor withdrawals. On October 24th, the president of the stock exchange walked to Morgan's office at 23 Wall Street. He told Morgan that without immediate funding, the exchange would have to close. If the stock exchange closed, the consequences would be catastrophic. Investors wouldn't be able to sell their holdings. Prices would collapse when trading resumed. Banks holding stocks as collateral would face massive losses. The entire financial system would freeze. Morgan had 20 minutes to find $25 million. He summoned the presidents of New York's major banks to his office. Within 15 minutes, the money was pledged. The stock exchange stayed open, but Morgan understood that piecemeal rescues wouldn't stop the panic. Something more dramatic was required. The library meeting on November 2nd was Morgan's solution. He gathered the presidents of New York's trust companies in his private library. The weakest institutions were hours from failure. If they collapsed, the panic would spread to every bank in America. Morgan's plan was simple but radical. The healthy trust companies would pool their resources to rescue the failing ones. Each institution would contribute proportionally based on its assets. The money would be used to meet depositor withdrawals and restore confidence, but the trust company presidents resisted. Why should they risk their capital to save competitors? Why not let the weak fail and absorb their customers afterward? Morgan understood something they didn't. In a panic, there is no afterward. If the weak institutions failed, their depositors would run on healthy banks next. The entire system would collapse. Saving competitors wasn't charity, it was survival. But the bankers couldn't see beyond their own balance sheets. They argued for hours while Morgan waited. He played solitaire. He examined rare manuscripts. He let them exhaust themselves. Around 4 a.m., resistance finally broke. Morgan presented the agreement. One by one, the bankers signed. By 4:45 a.m., the panic was effectively over. Morgan had demonstrated absolute control over the American financial system, not through legal authority, through sheer force of will and the power of his reputation. One man had done what the entire federal government could not. In the weeks after the crisis, newspapers across America told a simple story. J.P. Morgan had saved the nation. One man, one night, selfless heroism in the face of catastrophe. The New York Times called the library meeting the most remarkable financial rescue in history. Morgan was compared to Washington and Lincoln, a titan who put country before profit. But the hero narrative obscured essential details. Morgan's own banks were among those most exposed to the crisis. The institutions he saved were those with which he had business relationships. The competitors he allowed to fail were those challenging his dominance, and the rescue gave him control of the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company. During the crisis, a brokerage firm that owned Tennessee Coal stock was collapsing. Morgan offered to buy Tennessee Coal to save the firm, but he needed President Roosevelt's approval to avoid antitrust prosecution. At 10 p.m. on November 3rd, Morgan's partners took a train to Washington. By 9 a.m. the next morning, they had Roosevelt's verbal approval. Morgan bought Tennessee Coal for a fraction of its value. The acquisition made U.S. Steel, Morgan's company, even more dominant in the steel industry. Critics later argued Morgan had exploited the crisis for personal gain. He certainly benefited enormously. The institutions he rescued owed him. The government owed him. And that debt would be repaid through the Federal Reserve. The Panic of 1907 convinced Congress that America needed a central bank. The chaos had been too severe. The dependence on one private citizen too dangerous. In 1908, Congress passed the Aldrich-Vreeland Act. It created a temporary mechanism for emergency currency and established a commission to study banking reform. Senator Nelson Aldrich led the commission. Aldrich was Morgan's closest ally in the Senate. His daughter had married John D. Rockefeller Jr. He was the voice of Wall Street in Washington. In November 1910, Aldrich organized a secret meeting. 7 men traveled to Jekyll Island, a private resort off the coast of Georgia. They used first names only to avoid detection. They told anyone who asked that they were going on a hunting trip. The 7 men included representatives of the Morgan and Rockefeller banking empires and of the investment bank Kuhn, Loeb, and Company. Together, they represented approximately 1/4 of the world's wealth. For 9 days, they drafted the plan for what would become the Federal Reserve, a central bank with the power to issue currency, to set interest rates, to lend to banks in a crisis, to do legally and permanently what J.P. Morgan had done privately in 1907. Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act in December 1913. President Woodrow Wilson signed it into law. Morgan died in March 1913, 9 months before seeing his creation completed, but his fingerprints were all over it. The Federal Reserve was designed to institutionalize the power Morgan had demonstrated, a permanent mechanism for crisis response controlled by bankers. In September 2008, the American financial system faced its worst crisis since 1907. Lehman Brothers had collapsed. AIG was hours from failure. Credit markets were frozen, and the government convened an emergency meeting, not in Morgan's library, in the offices of the New York Federal Reserve. The attendees weren't trust company presidents. They were the CEOs of Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, J.P. Morgan Chase, and Citigroup. The dynamics were identical to 1907. Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson, a former Goldman Sachs CEO, orchestrated the response. He told the banks what would happen. Some would receive government bailouts. Some would be forced to merge. Some would fail. The government guaranteed $700 billion in troubled assets. The Federal Reserve provided unlimited liquidity, and the banks that survived became larger and more powerful than before. Too big to fail. The 2008 crisis followed Morgan's playbook to the letter. Stage 1, a financial crisis begins. Stage 2, the government proves inadequate. Stage 3, a rescue is organized by financial elites. Stage 4, the rescuers are celebrated as heroes. Stage 5, the rescue mechanism becomes permanent. After 1907, we got the Federal Reserve. After 2008, we got Dodd-Frank and a permanent too-big-to-fail status. The pattern always consolidates power in the hands of those who do the rescuing. Morgan understood this in 1907. Wall Street understands it today. The crisis is never wasted. It's used to justify more control. If you've watched this far, you understand the rescue playbook. You see how 1907 and 2008 followed the exact same 5 stages. Subscribe to Capital Origins, because when the next crisis hits, when the next emergency requires unprecedented intervention, you'll want to know which stage you're in and who benefits from the rescue. The crisis always creates opportunity. For those who wrote the playbook, hit subscribe, because the panic of 1907 happened over a century ago, but the playbook is still running, and the next rescue will consolidate even more power. You just need to recognize it before they call it heroism.